My name is Lynn Garrison, and I'm an Extension Assistant for the Kentucky State University Environmental Education and Research Center. And the main task I've had so far has been to inventory the plants at the center. And it's really interesting because this area is 306 acres, and we have found 506 species of plants. And now that 506 species, 420 or 82% of them are native plants, and 18% are non-native. And if you compared that to Kentucky as a whole, 78% of the plants are native and 22% are non-native. So this is actually in better shape ecologically than what the average is for the state of Kentucky. At one time, it was probably mostly cleared for agricultural purposes, and it is in the recovery stage now. There are some ravines that are down on the western end of the property and northwestern end of the property that have some areas where probably the timber was never harvested. It was probably too steep to be harvested. And the biggest amount of cleared land in Henry County was between 1900 and 1920. And the reason there was so much cleared land at that particular point in time is that was before hybrid corns, that was before we were using fertilizer, and the average production of corn was like 20 bushels per acre, and now it's like 150 bushels per acre, so we don't need as much. The other reason we don't need as much now as we did in the past land to grow the crops is because prior to the 30s, most of the land was tilled using draft animals. So they used solar energy from the energy that was collected from the sun by the plants. And then when we started using fossil fuel to tractors, then that reduced by a large amount the amount of corn we had to produce each year. And so after about 1920, the population, the number of farms started going down and acreage in farm went down. But it's a beautiful area. It's an excellent area to teach people about the ecosystem here. It's an excellent area to do research, or it's an excellent area just to get out and have fun looking at all the different types of wildflowers, especially at this time of the year. You see a lot of wildflowers. Now, one thing I mentioned was non-native species, and we really didn't start thinking about how much of a problem non-native species were until President Clinton in 1999 issued an executive order mandating how the federal government would deal with non-native species. And that executive order defined a non-native species. It's basically just a species that didn't originate in that particular area. And the native species are the species that did originate in the area. And when we have non-native species introduced into an area of native habitat, what happens is they don't have anything that keeps them in check like they did in the habitat where they came from. And as a consequence, they will outcompete the native species. And one of the non-native species we're going to be looking at today, the main one we're going to be looking at, is autumn olive. Now, an exotic species, which is another term you hear a lot, an exotic species is a species that has been introduced from a different continent. But a non-native don't necessarily have to be from a different continent. It could be from a different part of this continent or this country. Usually when we talk about native and non-native species, we would say a species that is native to, and then use a geographic qualifier. A species that is native to EERC, a species that's native to Kentucky, or a species that's native to the United States. But now, so the autumn olive that we're looking at today, it is both a non-native species because it didn't originate here. And it's also an exotic species because it was introduced in the 1830s from Asia into this country. So it's actually an Asian species. In olive is extremely aggressive. It produces its own nitrogen, so it can grow in areas that a lot of other plants would not grow. It leaves out early. If you look at the autumn olive behind me, it's already leaving out. Most of the other trees are not leaving out. And that's one thing that gives it such a competitive advantage is its ability the leaves come out early, and then the leaves are dropped off later in the year than most other plants are. It is spread by the effects of birds carrying the seeds from one place to another one. One big autumn olive tree, like the one further back behind me there, that would produce probably about 200,000 seeds. The seeds will remain viable for up to 3 years in soil. So once you remove the trees, there's a possibility they're going to come back up from seeds that were there before you removed the trees. But the Kentucky State Environmental Education and Research Center is, as I said, it's a good example of a recovering ecosystem that at one time had been mostly in agriculture and is returning back to a forest land. It's good to be able to recognize from a distance an autumn olive from the other species that looks pretty much like it. There are a few Russian olives in Kentucky, but not very many. Most of the ones we have in Kentucky are the autumn olive. But in this area, the one that looks the most like it from a distance is the spice bush. Both of them grow in clumps, but the spice bush is a native species. Deer do not eat it, so it has a feeding deterrent for deer. And so there are lots of spice bushes in this area. And this is the autumn olive, which also grows from clumps. And like I said, from a distance, they look very, very similar. The bark on the autumn olive is smoother. The bark on the spice bush, the lenticels are somewhat raised, and it gives it more of a bumpy appearance than what you have on the autumn olive, even though the autumn olive's lenticels look somewhat similar. And as I mentioned earlier, the autumn olive does come out very early in the year as far as leafing out. So a good time to look for autumn olives is right now because they're leaved out when most other stuff is not leaved out. And when we're talking about using a method to eradicate autumn olive or any other type of invasive species, it's really important that we identify and know that we're removing what we want to remove. And as we saw earlier, it's real easy to confuse autumn olive and spice bush. And if you're going to use volunteers, probably the best thing to do would be to make sure you identify the trees ahead of time and flag them. You can use different color flagging for ones like spice bush and autumn olive. And like we said before, spice bush is native and autumn olive isn't. Yeah, on this side, they were very successful in removing the autumn olive. I've walked the entire site 2 times in early March, and out of that I found the 2 trees in the center of the field, which was probably missed, and I found 2 stump sprouts and 3 seedlings. And these will be real easy to control. So anytime you do an eradication process, it's really important to periodically go back in and evaluate and see if you were successful. And especially it's important to go back in and remove anything that may have come back up after you did the initial eradication process. The first thing they did was they went in and they cut the autumn olive off down, and then they removed the autumn olive from the field, and it's kind of scattered along the edge of the field. And then they came in and treated it with treated the stumps with a chemical, a herbicide, that would actually kill the roots of the plant. Probably the best one to use in this type of situation is triclopyr. Imazapyr is also very good. And sometimes people use a combination of glyphosate and triclopyr. But I found that using just pure triclopyr works the best. Another thing is that anytime you use a chemical, you need to make sure you follow the label directions to the letter. As a matter of fact, it's illegal to not follow the label directions. So after they treated it, then we've come back in and looked to see how many were coming back up and take action to remove those. And the other thing they have done is they have bush hogged it, and after it was treated. But the one thing that's real neat to do is to enter all your data into either EDD Map S, which is by invasive species. You can go to invasive.org and get that program. You can enter your data. You can record when it was treated, how you treated it, when you return to analyze and see if your treatment was successful, and then what steps you took to adapt to whatever changes that happened. And another program that we use a lot of time is IMAP. And IMAP is one that is provided by NatureServe. It's also, both of them are free. And it does essentially the same thing. You can enter all your data into that program, and that way you can track what you're doing and what's happening with the area over time. And also, EDD, the good thing about it's used by the Invasive Weed Council, because they can go back and look at this and know what's going on the broader landscape on the properties across Kentucky or across the country. This type of removing invasive species is very labor intensive, and sometimes you can reduce the impact on the organization by getting volunteers to work on it. But anytime you have volunteers, you need to make sure they have the appropriate training, and also that the plants are appropriately identified. Now, in addition to chemicals, another thing that's often used on autumn olive is goats and sheep. And goats in particular do a pretty good job on olive autumn, and goats will actually strip the bark off of the trees, kind of like you saw the deer had done where they were horning the trees when they were removing their velvet. But if you use goats and sheep, you got to remember that goats and sheep will eat almost anything. So before you use goats and sheep for removing invasive species, you want to go through and see what else you have. Are there some rare plants in the area that need to be protected? And if so, you need to give them the appropriate protection before you release goats and sheep. And then the last thing is, what happens once an area like this has been treated and the autumn olives removed or any other invasive removed? Well, if you do nothing, the first thing that's going to happen is squirrels are going to carry in black walnuts and leave them here. Some seeds are going to blow in. Birds are going to carry in a lot of seeds, and so eventually it's going to revegetate. And if you got a good population of native plants surrounding the area, that would provide a seed source. So I would expect that a lot of the plants that have come back up in an area like this, if you just completely leave it alone, would probably be native species. But there's probably going to also be a few autumn olives come back up because there's autumn olive close to here. Another thing you need to do where you do have autumn olive in an area is to check it. One of the characteristics of autumn olive, it will not grow in a dense shade very well. So normally they don't invade a forest. But if you go through the forest around here, there's a lot of old trees. Some of the old trees have fallen, and it leaves a huge light gap, which would be ideal habitat for the autumn olive. So we need to go back in and check the different light gaps that are pretty close to where the autumn olives are, and make sure that we're not getting autumn olive come back up in those light gaps. But it is really important that once the project like this is completed, that you do periodically go back and look at it and periodically remove what is going to come up, because there are going to be some things come back up in the area.